Welcome to the Channel English Epics. Dorian stood in the long check-in line at the airport, gazing at the beautiful profile of his charming wife, Salomea. She was one of those rare people whose profile was even more stunning than her face, from the front. He didn't just love her, he adored her. He had searched for her for a long time, but she was worth every second of waiting. He couldn't help but smile at the sight of her boyish haircut, her cute button nose, and her perfectly shaped lips. "What's so funny, Dor?" Salomea asked with a soft smile without turning her head. "Nothing, Sal. You're just amazing," he said with pride, admiring her long, muscular legs, which were elegantly accentuated by her yoga pants. Their relationship had its ups and downs. Dorian was not an easy man. He was a man of principles. Few people could live up to his high moral standards. Sal was one of a kind. She wasn't an easy person herself, an uncompromising vegan, a minimalist, an environmental activist, and a volunteer at an animal shelter. It would be fair to say that if they hadn't met, they both would have likely remained single for a long time. They were introduced 2 years ago by their mutual friend, Betty. Sal and Betty had worked together for the past 10 years in the legal department of a large advertising agency. Betty had initially dated Dorian. The spark between them ignited instantly, but their opposing worldviews and Dorian's complete unwillingness to compromise made continuing their relationship nearly impossible. However, in the end, they remained good friends. It wasn't difficult for Betty to introduce him to her best friend, Sal. They weren't a perfect couple. Dorian was only a vegetarian, not a vegan. He leaned right politically, while she leaned left. He loved dogs, while she preferred cats. His Belgian Malinois didn't get along with her ginger cat. He preferred spending time alone with her, whereas she thrived on socializing, parties, and gatherings. Nevertheless, their shared values overcame their differences, and love ignited in an instant. 10 months after their first date, they got married. In 2 weeks, they would be celebrating their first wedding anniversary. A month ago, Sal stopped using birth control. They were ready to have children. Dorian worked as a department manager at a major security company, a job arranged for him by one of his former army commanders. His military service was shrouded in secrecy. Whatever he had done for his country, he had done it exceptionally well. He left the service at 27 after experiencing too many losses. Despite this, his commanders and contacts gladly helped ease his transition into civilian life. Even so, he was occasionally called back to active reserve duty. This usually happened 3 or 4 times a year, unexpectedly, but never for long. Fortunately for him, these assignments typically lasted only a few days. His friends and family knew better than to ask any questions. Sal's upcoming trip was work-related but had turned into a highly anticipated event. Once a year, her company treated its employees and their spouses to a 4-day, 3-night, all-inclusive resort getaway in addition to unlimited alcohol available around the clock. There were daytime and nighttime parties with DJs, stand-up, comedy shows, small island excursions, and exclusive attractions. The company spared no expense. Dorian was smiling at Sal with adoration when his phone rang. His smile vanished the moment he saw the caller ID. "Don't answer it!" Sal cried out in frustration. He grimaced in agony and shook his head, but still pressed the phone to his ear. Yes, I understand. I'm already on my way." "No," Sal whimpered. "I'm so sorry," Dorian whispered sincerely. "You know I have to go. But hey, have fun for both of us, okay?" Sal nodded, clearly disheartened. Dorian gave her a quick kiss, turned around, and walked out of the terminal. She watched him leave with longing eyes until she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was Betty. "We're going to have the best time of our lives," Betty promised her. "Best friend. Well, from this moment on, you're stuck with me." The flight and the trip to the resort were relatively short, and check-in went smoothly. Fortunately, Betty and her roommate, Lisa, had a room, not too far from Sal's. Sal caught her breath when she stepped onto her balcony and saw the breathtaking deep blue bay stretching out before her. The resort's rooms were arranged in rows along the hillside, sloping down toward the beach, where all the restaurants, bars, clubs, and sports facilities were located. Luckily for Betty and Sal, their row wasn't too high up, otherwise, climbing back up the stairs could have been exhausting. After a quick shower and a change of clothes, Sal met up with her friends, and they headed down to the dining hall for lunch. Afterward, they hopped over to the bar. They were buzzing with excitement and in high spirits by the time they returned to Betty and Lisa's room. Oscar and Ben, two young copywriters staying in the neighboring room, strolled in uninvited. Wearing mischievous grins, Oscar pulled out a cigarette and asked if they wanted to celebrate. The girls giggled and nodded eagerly. "Where did you get that?" Betty asked in surprise. "The porter who brought our luggage asked if we needed anything else," Oscar replied smugly. "Consider this our mood booster for the entire trip." Ben placed a portable speaker on the coffee table and connected it to his phone via Bluetooth while Oscar lit the cigarette. He took a deep drag before passing it to Sal. As she exhaled, melodic techno beats began pulsing from the speaker. A pleasant dizziness washed over her almost instantly. A forbidden thought crept into her mind. If Dora were here with me, I wouldn't be sitting in this room with my friends, enjoying this wonderful cigarette. Dora had drawn a hard line when it came to alcohol and was quite strict about it. He hated the feeling of losing control. I wish he could loosen up a little, Sal thought. She passed the cigarette to Betty, nodding approvingly to signal that it was good stuff. Soon they were all chatting, giggling, and laughing uncontrollably. Well, almost all of them. While most people became talkative after smoking, Sal tended to retreat into herself. Adding alcohol to the mix only made her quieter and more withdrawn. She sank into the chair with half-closed eyes, slowly swaying her head and shoulders, enjoying the music and the pleasant tingling sensations spreading through her body. Ben went to his room and returned with bottles of vodka, lemon juice, and disposable cups he had bought earlier at duty-free. Betty made sure Sal got her drink in a proper glass. Sal didn't believe in using plastic. After raising their glasses, for a toast, they started swaying to the soothing music playing in the room. Their vacation had begun the right way. Later that evening, the group of 5 sat together at a table for dinner. Sal and Oscar were completely absorbed in each other, exchanging flirty glances and smiles non-stop. When this continued at the bar, Betty got the distinct impression that they had lost interest in the rest of the group. Sal was in her room, getting ready for the beach party, when Betty suddenly walked in. "Do you want to tell me what exactly is going on between you two?" Betty asked bluntly. "Honestly, nothing," Sal replied with a hint of embarrassment. "It's just nice for a change to get a little attention from a man no one even dares to look at me when Dora is around. He scares them off just by existing." "Nothing," Betty asked skeptically. "I don't want to sound awful," Sal said, "but in a way I'm glad Dora isn't here. He's always so tense, even when he pretends to be laid back, and it stresses me out. It's refreshing to feel free and just have some fun for once. If he were here, I wouldn't be hanging out with you guys in your room, and I definitely wouldn't be smoking or drinking more than a single glass of wine. He's always so serious and cautious, it's boring. For example, when we're at a restaurant, he always sits with his back to the wall, constantly scanning the main and rear entrances. He thinks I don't notice, but even when he's supposedly talking to me, he's always watching other diners and even pedestrians outside the restaurant. But tonight, Oscar is giving me all his attention. Oscar isn't playing the eternal game of agents and spies. It's not exactly a game, Betty said sternly. It's not just that Dora is used to acting this way. There's always a chance that someone could actually be watching him. I know, but he's not here right now. He left, and I'm on my own. So now I have a few days to truly relax. This is my first real chance in 2 years to just let go a little, and I'm going to make the most of it. Just be careful, okay? Of course. Later that evening, Sal stopped by Betty's room again. She could hear muffled voices drifting up from the beach. She wasn't surprised to find Oscar and Ben sitting by the coffee table, holding drinks and smoking a cigarette. When they saw her, their jaws practically dropped. She was wearing a short black slip dress that left little to the imagination. The two intoxicated men were practically drooling. Sal could hear a flurry of noises coming from the bathroom. Betty and Lisa were still getting ready. Oscar offered Sal a drink and a cigarette. When Betty and Lisa finally emerged, Oscar and Ben exchanged knowing glances. At that moment, they felt like the luckiest man on the island. That night, a full moon hung in the sky. The beach party hardly needed any additional lighting. By 10 p.m., many of the revelers could barely stand. The open bars had left everyone far too drunk. Betty's group was feeling much the same way. On top of being drunk, they were also slightly overheated. Oscar stayed glued to Sal, and Betty didn't like the way Sal allowed him to put his hands on her now and then. Meanwhile, Ben was desperately trying to make a move on Betty and Lisa, but they kept shutting him down. It wasn't personal. They did the same with anyone who stumbled over and tried their luck. No matter how drunk they were, both Betty and Lisa knew that getting involved with a colleague was a bad idea. As midnight approached, the DJ switched to melodic techno, and the slow, sensual rhythm turned up the heat on the sandy dance floor. Oscar and Sal gradually drifted away from the rest of the group, moving toward the edge of the crowd. When they felt anonymous enough, they stepped closer together, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. He responded by gripping her waist, his hands resting dangerously close to her lower back, just shy of her backside. Beyond the drinking, smoking, and sensual dancing, there was one more factor that made this night dangerously intoxicating for Sal. Her estrogen levels had peaked. For the month, she was ovulating, and the tension in her body was undeniable. At some point, Sal stopped caring about Dor, Betty, Lisa, or anyone else. The only thing on her mind was releasing the pent-up sexual tension that had been building inside her all day, reaching an almost maddening level. When Oscar pressed his hips against hers, she felt his sighs rubbing against her, and she shuddered so intensely that she feared she might lose control right there on the beach. She turned around and pressed her back against him, letting him wrap his arms around her hips. He buried his nose in the nape of her neck, and she felt the delicious heat of friction as he pressed closer. At a certain moment, she simply couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the shoreline. When she thought they were far enough from the party, and more importantly, out of Betty's watchful sight, she lunged at him, capturing his lips in a wet, passionate kiss, letting her hands roam freely over his body. "We're not going all the way," she told herself. "We'll just give each other a little pleasure this once and end it there for tonight." "Follow me," she whispered into Oscar's ear. She quickly made her way toward the path leading to the stairs, and he followed closely behind. She rushed up the steps without lifting her gaze, fooling herself into believing that if she didn't see any passers-by, they wouldn't see her either. By the time she and Oscar reached her room, both were breathless, partly from the climb, partly from the tension between them. Her hands were shaking too much to unlock the door, so she had to hand him the keycard. Oscar handled it effortlessly. Both of them knew exactly what was waiting for them inside. As soon as the door closed behind them, they devoured each other. After a while of passionate kissing, their excitement grew, and they let themselves get carried away in the moment. Sal surrendered to the sensations, allowing herself to enjoy the experience without overthinking. Oscar was eager and attentive, making sure she felt as much pleasure as he did. He wasn't as big or muscular as Dor, but he more than made up for it with enthusiasm and stamina. The admiration in his eyes flattered her, feeding her ego in a way she hadn't expected. They lost themselves completely, exploring each other without restraint. The mix of alcohol, dancing, and the night's events eventually took its toll. Exhausted, Sal collapsed onto the mattress, her body heavy with fatigue. She barely registered Oscar moving behind her, his warmth pressing against her skin as sleep overtook her. The last thing she remembered before slipping into unconsciousness was his deep, satisfied sigh. The next morning, Sal woke up with a terrible hangover, and Oscar was nowhere to be seen. At first, everything felt hazy. She had no idea where she was. Then, like a poisoned arrow piercing her temples, the first coherent thought struck her. My marriage is over. That horrifying realization quickly spiraled into full-blown panic. The guilt and shame were more than she could bear. What have I done? She berated herself. I'm a stupid adulteress. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She yanked at her hair, but her strength failed her. She ran to the bathroom expecting to throw up, but nothing happened. Desperate for relief, she gulped down rusty water straight from the sink faucet. Then she stumbled back to bed and collapsed. Wrapping herself in the sheets, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. After a while, a dark thought crept into her mind, and she rushed out onto the balcony. Ha! The slope, she thought bitterly. It's a damn slope. I can't even kill myself. Desperate and broken, she returned to bed and lay there for hours, unmoving. No matter how many scenarios she played out in her mind, they all ended the same way. Dora would eventually find out what had happened. The only way forward was to confess everything, but he likely wouldn't forgive her. And even if he did, their relationship would never be the same again. Dorian would never trust her again, and rightfully so. Even she didn't trust herself. She asked herself honestly whether she could forgive Dor if the situation were reversed. The answer was a resounding no. At breakfast, Oscar and Ben quickly realized they were no longer welcome at the girls' table. They were visibly disappointed, but didn't make a scene. Later that day, Betty and Lisa rented a car and drove to the other side of the island to visit a landmark known as Pink Beach. They debated whether to invite Sal, but ultimately decided against it. She hadn't shown up for breakfast or lunch, so they assumed she needed some time alone. On the way there, they picked up two young Italian hitchhikers. Pink Beach was in a secluded area, about a half-hour walk from the nearest parking lot. But the effort was worth it. The pink sand wasn't just beautiful, it was also incredible. On the way back, they stopped at a vegan restaurant and picked up some takeout for Sal. They also managed to get her a couple of pills for the morning. At first, Sal didn't answer the door, but after Lisa nearly broke it down, she relented and let them in. She looked awful. Her hair was a mess, her face was swollen and red from crying, and the stale air in the room suggested she hadn't showered since the day before. Betty and Lisa pulled their friend into a long, comforting group hug. It took a lot of convincing, but Sal eventually agreed to take a shower and eat something. However, she flatly refused to go down to the dining hall with them. She didn't want to see the knowing looks or hear the whispers. Completely sober and unable to sleep, Sal endured a long and agonizing night. Her mind raised with difficult questions and no answers. How would she tell Dor? How much should she confess? How could she convince him that it was a one-time mistake, and that she was willing to do anything to make it right? At last, after hours of inner turmoil, she reached a painful decision. She was a practical woman. If she was destined to lose her husband, then no matter how much it hurt, she had no choice but to move forward. The next day at lunch, Betty and Lisa were stunned when Sal suddenly walked into the dining hall wearing a vibrant sundress, looking radiant and smiling. However, she carefully avoided making eye contact with the other guests. Dinner went well, and Sal even joined them for the final beach party that evening, though this time she avoided drinking and smoking. At 2 in the morning, Sal heard a soft knock on her door. She was still awake. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Oscar standing there alone, his eyes pleading. She shook her head and shut the door. The next day, Betty, Sal, and Lisa stood calmly in line at the terminal, waiting to check in for their flight home. Behind them, Oscar and Ben kept chatting away, looking cheerful and carefree. At some point, Betty couldn't take it anymore. She turned around, shot Oscar a sharp look, and said, "You look awfully pleased for someone whose days are numbered. You'd better disappear the moment the plane lands. Dorian won't be in a hurry. He'll take his time making you suffer. And with his connections, he could confess to murder and still walk free." Then she turned to Ben. "He'll probably decide you were an accomplice, Ben. I wouldn't be surprised if he's already waiting for you at the airport when we land." Both men turned pale as a sheet. They didn't know much about Dorian's military past, but he was still the biggest and scariest guy they had ever met. Sal called Dorian and insisted that he not pick her up from the airport since Betty would drive her home. She figured that the moment Dorian saw her, he'd know something was wrong. She didn't want them to end up in a ditch on the side of the road. Dorian was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Sal walked through the door. He immediately dropped everything and rushed to embrace and kiss her. He knew something was off the moment she turned her face, offering her cheek instead of her lips. An hour later, they sat at the dinner table in complete silence. The tension in the air was unbearable. "I have bad news," Sal finally said, her voice trembling. Dor didn't say a word as Sal, tears in her eyes, recounted everything that had happened. She hid nothing. She repeated and emphasized that it was a one-time mistake, a reckless mix of alcohol, cigarettes, and an unfortunate moment in her cycle. She swore she would do anything to earn his forgiveness and a second chance. She was practically begging. When she had nothing left to say, Dorian stood up and asked grimly, "You said Betty and Lisa were drinking and smoking with you. Did either of them end up in bed with a coworker?" "No, but—" He didn't let her finish. He stormed into the bedroom and began packing a duffel bag. "No," Sal cried behind him. "I should be the one to leave." "Shut up," he hissed. Once he was done packing, he headed for the front door, only to find Sal standing there, blocking his way. "Move," he ordered. "No," she pleaded. "Please, please stay." He placed his large hand on her shoulder and effortlessly pushed her aside. He was about to open the door when she grabbed his arm with all her strength, whimpering. Her tears and pain finally reached him, and he froze. Sal lowered her hand as she saw his broad shoulders begin to tremble. She lifted her hand, almost touching his shoulder, but hesitated and let it hover over his shaking body instead. She wanted so badly to wrap her arms around him and never let go, but she knew that wouldn't help. She understood that if he ever decided to come back to her, it had to be because he wanted to, not just as an instinctive reaction to the sound of his wife's pain. He lingered for a moment, but eventually walked out. Dorian was on his way to a motel when he suddenly changed his mind and turned around. He needed to hear Sal's story from someone he could trust. He also didn't want to be alone. By the time Betty let him into her apartment, a cup of coffee was already waiting for him. Betty confirmed all the details of Sal's story and added a few of her own, including Sal's rejection of Oscar the previous night. She told Dorian that Sal had been crying nonstop for 2 days and that at one point she had even feared for Sal's safety. She also pleaded with him not to go after Oscar, insisting he wasn't worth the trouble, and mentioned that she doubted Oscar would even show up for work on Monday. Dorian sat in brooding silence for an hour, staring at the floor without saying a word. Finally, he got up, went to the guest room, and locked the door behind him. Betty didn't think it was the right time to tell him to forgive or move on. He needed time to process everything. By noon the next day, Dorian still hadn't left the room or responded to her knocking. Betty placed a tray of food outside his door and told him she was going to check on Sal. Sal was in even worse shape than she had been 2 days ago. It took Betty a long time to convince her to eat and drink something. Fortunately, she was too weak and apathetic to resist when Betty dragged her into the bathroom. Closing the bathroom door behind her, Betty collapsed onto the floor and broke down in tears. The 2 people she loved most were trapped in a terrible situation, and there was nothing she could do to help them. Dorian still hadn't come out of The guest room when Betty returned from work the next day. She decided to make dinner, preparing all his favorite vegetarian dishes, along with a special baked salmon. She smiled to herself in satisfaction when she heard his bedroom door open, followed by the sound of the bathroom door closing. By the time he sat down at the dinner table, he looked almost like his usual self. He even smiled and talked more than he normally did. After dinner, they sat in the living room with a bottle of wine. "What are you going to do?" Betty asked. "I'm getting a divorce. Isn't that a bit hasty? The first chance she got, she cheated on me. If you hadn't gotten her those pills, she'd be carrying that bastard's child right now. She made a terrible mistake, but she's only human. She won't make it again. The hell she won't. Once a cheater, always a cheater. Do you really believe that cliché?" "Yes, absolutely. She'll never drink or smoke without you again. I doubt she'll go anywhere without you except for work. It doesn't have to happen under the same circumstances. All it takes is the right situation." Betty tilted her head and gave him a questioning look, but he just gave her a knowing glance and smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she said. "Not a third, just a second. Sal deserves one more chance. If she ever messes up again, I'll throw her to the wolves myself. I've known her for 10 years. She's a good person, and she loves you. Even good people cheat and do awful things. They don't deserve special treatment. I really think you're wrong about this. Not just about people in general, but especially about Sal. We're all capable of making critical mistakes, if the circumstances align just right or just wrong, I suppose. Then why didn't you or Lisa make that mistake? You're not even married." "Well, not being married, we couldn't make that particular mistake. But we certainly had our fun, but not with co-workers. And I bet money you use protection. Always bet on Betty." "You won't lose," she said with a playful grin. "Tell you what," she said after a pause. "Give her another chance. Just 1 week. If after that week you decide you can't go on, I'll understand. But at least try for both of you and for me. I love you both so much. I'd do anything to keep you two together." "What?" "Anything. I have an idea, but I don't think you'll like it." "Wanna bet?" Sal stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. Betty had already told her that Dorian had decided to give her another chance and would be coming home that evening. When she heard the front door open, she turned cautiously. At first, Dorian stood in the doorway, looking tense, but the moment he smiled at her, she dropped everything, ran to him, jumped into his arms, wrapped her legs around his waist, and covered his face with kisses. He tried to dodge them the way someone avoids the affectionate licks of an overly eager puppy, simply patting her back gently. Dinner was pleasant, and Sal didn't sense any resentment from him. For the first time in a week, she felt happy and hopeful. That night in bed, however, he politely rejected her advances. "It's still too soon for me," he explained, and she understood. She didn't fool herself into thinking that everything would go back to the way it was overnight, but she had all the patience in the world because she had hope. In the days that followed, they went out for dinner and shopping, cuddled on the couch in front of the TV each evening, and even shared a few light kisses. Everything seemed promising. However, on Friday night, Dorian dropped a bombshell. They were sitting close together on the couch, watching TV, when Dorian suddenly said, "I have bad news." Sal tensed and looked at him warily. When Betty convinced, "Me to give you another chance," he said coldly, his eyes fixed on the screen. "It was on the condition that you feel my pain." Salomia tilted her head in confusion. "The only way for us to move forward is if I even the score." "Well, what?" Sal stammered. "I'm going to spend the weekend with Betty. If you can accept that, then when I come back, maybe we can really start over. She would never dare to hurt me like that. She wouldn't. That was my only condition, and she's already agreed. I'm leaving tomorrow night and we'll be back Sunday evening, and then we can move on. No, please don't do this. This is insane. She's my best friend. Please don't do this to me." Dorian stood up and walked into the master bedroom, leaving Sal sobbing on the couch. Eventually, she managed to fall asleep, convincing herself that this was just a cruel test. "They're just trying to push me," she reassured herself. "This is some kind of twisted revenge. Nothing will actually happen between them." The next evening, Sal stood in their bedroom, watching as her husband packed his duffel bag. "Don't," she whispered one last time before he walked out the door. She ran to the living room window and watched as he got into his car and drove away. A part of her still clung to the hope that this was just a cruel joke. But when she saw his car disappear down the street, she grabbed her keys and ran to her own car. Dorian had just stepped into Betty's apartment building lobby when Sal pulled up. She parked by the curb in front of the building and looked up at Betty's apartment windows. She watched as the dim light in the living room grew brighter. She saw the shadows of figures flickering against the walls. About 20 minutes later, the living room light went out, and the light in Betty's bedroom switched on. A moment later, the entire apartment was plunged into darkness. For a brief second, Sal thought she saw the bedroom curtains shift, but she couldn't be sure. No one heard her anguished scream. She drove home in agony, tears streaming down her face. At first, she tried to convince herself that this was the price she had to pay for her betrayal. She forced herself to think about anything else, just to pass the time. But it was useless. Her mind kept circling back to her husband and her best friend. She imagined them pleasuring each other in bed, Betty's cries of ecstasy as waves of euphoria crashed over her. She pictured the adoring look on her husband's face as he gazed down at Betty's blissful expression, her satisfied smile beaming up at him. She imagined Dorian experiencing more pleasure, more intensity than he ever had with her. At some point, her jealousy and self-torment morphed into pure madness. She fantasized about grabbing a kitchen knife, running to Betty's apartment, and stabbing her the moment she opened the door. She even considered taking one of Dorian's guns from the safe and shooting them both in the head, but she knew he had taken the safe key with him. He always did. "Yes, I messed up big time once," she said aloud, her voice dripping with self-loathing. "But not with my damn best friend, who also happens to be his ex." She called Dorian's cell, but he didn't answer. Then she tried Betty, but every call went straight to voicemail. She even called Lisa, but there was no response. Sal was too distraught to realize how late it was. Each unanswered call felt like a fresh stab to the heart, another piece of the conspiracy against her. Finally, in sheer desperation, she called Oscar. He arrived surprisingly fast and behaved like a perfect gentleman. He patiently listened to her desperate cries and rambling explanations, handing her a glass of water. When she curled up on his lap, trembling, he gently patted her shoulder. As she started to calm down, he pressed a reassuring kiss to the top of her head, telling her everything would be all right. Seeing that the first kiss had soothed her, he followed it with another, this time on her cheek. Of course, he didn't resist when she suddenly kissed him passionately. In the bedroom, they repeated all the moves from their last night together, but this time it was even more thrilling and intense. For Sal, it was pure revenge sex, and nothing had ever felt hotter. Only after their third round did they finally collapse onto the sheets and drift into a deep, blissful sleep. Sometime later, Sal stirred from her slumber, awakened by the sudden glow of the bedroom light. "Why does this idiot have to turn on the light just to go to the bathroom?" she thought. Groggily, she turned over in bed and felt her hand brush against someone's body. "If he's in bed, then who turned on the light?" she thought in horror. Propping herself up on her elbows, she squinted painfully at the two figures standing at the foot of the bed. After several agonizing seconds, her drowsy eyes finally adjusted to the brightness. She saw Dorian and Betty standing there, staring at her naked body. Betty looked furious. Dorian, on the other hand, gazed down at Sal with a mix of pity and disgust, as if he were watching a gazelle being torn apart by a hyena. "You owe me $500, he said to Betty. Yeah, I know, Betty replied coldly. You were right. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Thank you for listening until the end. See you in the next episode of English Epics. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.